The winter that seized Red Rock in 1876 was not merely cold. It was vindictive, personal, a season that seemed to hold a grudge against anything foolish enough to draw breath. The prairie lay prostrate beneath a sky the color of tarnished pewter, and every fence post wore its armor of frost like a warrior preparing for battle. It knew it would lose. On the weathered porch of Lucinda's boarding house, Beatrice Harper pressed her temple against rough-hewn timber, welcoming the bite of splinters because that small, localized pain was easier to bear than the vast, shapeless dread coiling in her belly like a serpent. She was 19 years old, and in her trembling hands she clutched a pitiful bunch of red roses, cheap things purchased from a peddler's cart, already surrendering to the cold and their petals curling inward and browning at the edges like paper held too near a flame. The tears came, despite her best efforts to stop them scalding against frozen cheeks, pooling at the corners of her mouth, where they tasted of brine and ash, and all the foolish hopes she had carried west. Behind her, motionless as carved stone, stood Pakwa, Apache perhaps 23 winters, built lean as a hunting knife and twice as dangerous, despite the rope burns that had flayed his wrists to raw meat. The hemp fibers were still embedded in the wounds, dark against torn flesh, that wept clear fluid when he flexed his fingers. He did not look at Beatrice. His gaze traveled past her, ranging across the rutted street where chimney smoke rose in lazy columns, toward the squat jail where he had spent 3 days in a cell so cramped he could not fully stand toward the distant hills that held the memory of his people, like graves hold bones. In the yard, a horse stood saddled and ready, a dappled mare with intelligent eyes and flanks that twitched nervously, as if she too sensed the violence gathering like storm clouds. The sound of boots on frozen boardwalk reached them, not the casual rhythm of men walking, but the purposeful hammer strike of men hunting. Beatrice's voice emerged threadbare, scarcely louder than the wind that keened through the eaves, like a widow's lament. "They'll drag me back." Pakwa's response was not comfort. It was arithmetic cold as the season. "Then we do not stand still." A rifle shot cracked the morning, not close, but near enough to matter. The report rolled across the snow-covered prairie like an avalanche heard from a great distance, promising destruction not yet arrived, but inevitable nonetheless. Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, and the roses crumpled in her fist thorns, drawing blood she could not feel through the numbness that had claimed her hands. The boarding house. The shout came raw, now triumphant and ugly, with the certainty of men who believed they held all the cards. "They're at the damn boarding house." Pakwa's hand closed around her wrist, not gently, but with the bruising urgency of a man who understood that gentleness would get them both killed. Now. She ran because there was no longer any choice, and the roses tumbled from her grasp into the snow, where they lay like drops of arterial blood against a winding sheet, a promise of violence written in red and white. Beatrice had come west on what the broadsides and newspaper advertisements called opportunity, though what she had actually purchased for the price of her mother's wedding ring, her grandmother's cameo brooch, and the last tattered remnants of her hope was a mail-order marriage contract. It was a document as flimsy as prayer and twice as likely to be ignored when circumstance made it inconvenient. The contract promised union with one Jonathan Garrett, identified as a merchant in the town of Red Rock, population 400 and declining. She had anticipated hardship. Every woman who climbed aboard that rattling stagecoach understood that hardship was the price of admission to a new life. What Beatrice had not anticipated was a snare so elegantly constructed, so perfectly calibrated to her specific vulnerabilities, that by the time she finally understood its mechanism, escape had already become a fantasy she could no longer afford to entertain. Red Rock occupied the narrow, contested ground between the first jagged uprising of the Black Hills and a river bend that froze solid for 4 months out of every year. It was a town built on 3 pillars, cattle driven through on their inexorable march toward railheads farther east, gold ore hauled from the mine, back when the veins still ran rich and men still believed that wealth could be torn from the earth without consequence. and freight wagons supplying the handful of hardscrabble ranches that clung to existence in the territory, like barnacles on a ship's hull. The buildings stood straight enough, their facades freshly painted, to give the impression of permanence. The saloon even boasted glass windows, brought overland from St. Louis at ruinous expense, each paying a small fortune in sand and fire. The church possessed a bell that rang every Sunday morning, calling the faithful and the faithless alike to account for their sins. But beneath this veneer of civilization, Red Rock was a kingdom absolute and unquestioned, and its king wore a tin star. Sheriff Mortimer Cornelius had reached his 43rd year, tall and broad, through the shoulders possessed of the sort of face that belonged in a daguerreotype captioned "Pillar of the Community" or "Defender of Law and Order." His eyes were pale blue, the exact shade of winter ice over deep water. And when he smiled, which he did with calculated frequency, the expression never quite reached those glacial eyes. He had learned early through observation and instinct that soft words cut deeper than shouted threats, that a man who spoke gently while systematically taking everything you owned was far more dangerous than a common thug who at least possessed the virtue of honest brutality. Cornelius wore his authority the way other men wore their skin, comfortably, without conscious thought, as if it had always belonged to him and always would. He met Beatrice at the stage stop himself, and that should have been her first warning. Sheriffs did not personally greet every stagecoach that rattled into town. But Beatrice, exhausted from 2 weeks of being rattled like dice in a cup across rutted roads that seemed designed by sadists, her spine bruised purple from the unforgiving bench, and her hope bruised by something harder to name, saw only a kindly official removing his hat in the presence of a lady. "Miss Harper." His voice was warm molasses, smooth and sweet. "I'm afraid I must be the bearer of grievous news concerning your intended husband." The platform was crowded with the usual collection of frontier flotsam, a handful of cowboys waiting for mail that might never arrive, a freight agent checking manifests, with ink-stained fingers, a haggard woman with 2 small children clinging to her skirts like drowning sailors to wreckage. But Cornelius spoke as if they existed in perfect isolation, as if this moment of her unraveling was an intimacy too sacred to be shared with strangers. Beatrice's carpetbag slipped from nerveless fingers and struck the platform with a thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Her throat constricted. "Mr. Garrett went missing in the hills 3 weeks past." Cornelius shook his head with such practiced sorrow that it must have been rehearsed before a mirror. "We conducted an extensive search, naturally. Sent riders into every gulch and draw within 20 miles. But the country out there—" He gestured vaguely toward the west, where the land turned hostile and the law evaporated like morning dew. "It has a way of swallowing men whole. I am deeply, profoundly sorry for your loss." She stood there with the wind cutting through her wool traveling dress, a garment that had seemed adequate back in Pennsylvania, but proved laughably insufficient against the prairie's malice, and felt the earth tilt beneath her feet. Everything she owned in the world could fit inside the carpetbag at her feet. She possessed no family to write to for assistance. Her father dead of consumption 3 years prior, her mother remarried to a man who made abundantly clear that Beatrice's continued existence was an inconvenience. He would not tolerate her only brother, vanished into the California gold fields 2 years back, and silent ever since. The farm had been sold to settle debts. The last of her inheritance had purchased passage west. There was no return ticket. There was no return. Cornelius read all of this in her face, with the practiced ease of a card-sharp reading tells across a poker table, and his smile deepened by a fraction of an inch. "Now, you mustn't despair, Miss Harper. We are Christian people here in Red Rock, and we take care of our own. Lucinda Parr runs a most respectable boarding house, and she finds herself perpetually in need of capable help. You'll earn your keep through honest labor, washing, mending, kitchen duties, until we can determine the appropriate course of action. I've already spoken with Mrs. Parr on your behalf. Your first month's lodging has been settled. Beatrice wanted to ask questions, wanted to demand to see a body, to understand how a man simply vanished like smoke on wind, to know what happened to a legal contract that had cost her everything she possessed. But Cornelius's hand had already settled on her elbow with the deceptive gentleness of a trap closing, and she found herself being guided away from the stage and toward a town that would become her prison without bars. Lucinda Parr was a widow of perhaps 50, her face worn smooth by the twin forces of grief and fear, in measures she could no longer separate. She conducted Beatrice to a room on the second floor, barely large enough to contain a narrow bed and a battered washstand. The walls were constructed of planks so thin she could hear every cough and curse and whispered conversation from the adjoining rooms. The single window looked out upon an alley where rats conducted their business among the refuse, with the confidence of landowners surveying their holdings. "You'll work for your lodging." Lucinda's voice emerged barely above a whisper, as if speaking at normal volume might summon something terrible. "Take your meals in the kitchen after the paying boarders have been fed. Washing on Mondays and Thursdays. Mending whenever there's mending to be done. The sheriff has already paid your first month, so you owe him nothing yet." She paused, hands twisting her apron into tortured knots. "But you will owe him something eventually. Everyone in this town owes the sheriff something. And Cornelius always collects what he's owed. Always. I didn't ask him to pay. Doesn't signify." Lucinda's eyes remained fixed on the floorboards, as if meeting Beatrice's gaze might turn her to stone. "In Red Rock, you accept what the sheriff gives you. You do exactly what he tells you to do, or you end up like the others." "What others?" But Lucinda was already retreating, her footsteps soft as moth wings on the worn floorboards, leaving Beatrice alone with a question that would require blood to answer. The town's lifeblood pulsed through a single-source widow's well. It sat at Red Rock's western margin, surrounded by a fence that served less as decoration than as declaration of ownership. The well descended deep, some claimed it reached down 100 feet or more, tapping into some subterranean river that never froze and never failed. In a land where water meant survival and drought meant death, whoever controlled that well controlled everything: the ranches, the freight operations, the horses, the people themselves. Sheriff Cornelius had been systematically acquiring the water rights parcel by parcel using legal documents that appeared legitimate until someone examined them too closely. By then, of course, it was far too late. The well belonged to Cornelius, and so did the town's throat. Beatrice learned this truth in fragments assembled from whispered conversations in the general store. From the way men's voices dropped to furtive murmurs when Cornelius walked past, from the hollow-eyed women who arrived on the stage clutching contracts identical to hers and were never seen again after Cornelius took an interest in their circumstances. She learned that a railroad survey party had passed through the previous summermen with brass instruments and leather-bound ledgers, measuring grades and arguing over river crossings. They talked about a proposed branch line, still only ink on maps, that might someday tie the hills to the nearest main track farther east. If the railroad materialized, the man who owned the water rights would find himself wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice. Cornelius was not merely stealing, he was investing in a future where he would become absolutely untouchable. She also learned about the Apache warrior in the jail. His name was Paqua, though most of Red Rock's citizens did not trouble themselves to learn it. They called him the thief, or that savage, or simply gestured in his direction when forced to reference him, as if speaking his name might grant him too much humanity. The formal charge was horse theft. The animal in question, that same dappled mare now standing ready in Lucinda's yard, had allegedly been stolen from a rancher. Pakwa maintained that the horse belonged to him, earned through honest labor as a guide for a trading expedition. The rancher in question was conveniently dead. There were no witnesses to support either version of events. Cornelius's word was law, and Cornelius wanted the horse. Beatrice glimpsed Pakwa through the jail's barred window one afternoon as she walked past arms laden with a basket of mending. He sat on the cell's dirt floor with his spine pressed against the stone wall, wrists bound, despite the fact that he already inhabited a locked cage. His face was constructed of sharp angles, prominent cheekbones, a strong jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once and healed slightly crooked. His hair fell long and black as a raven's wing secured at his nape with a strip of leather. He appeared young, perhaps only a handful of years her senior, but his eyes contained the sort of age that came from watching everything you loved be systematically stripped away. He did not look at her. His gaze traveled through her, focused on something she could not perceive, a place perhaps, or a person. Or simply the memory of what freedom tasted like before it was taken. Red Rock possessed exactly one man who still remembered what decency looked like, and his name was Dr. Charles Owen. He had reached his 58th year, his hair gone predominantly gray, with a few defiant streaks of black remaining, his hands marked by scars accumulated over decades of setting shattered bones and stitching torn flesh in a place where violence was commonplace and anesthetic remained a luxury. He had arrived in the territory 20 years prior, carrying ideals like baggage, and he had watched those ideals erode like riverbanks in spring flood. But he had not yet surrendered entirely. He kept meticulous notes. He documented patterns. When a woman arrived on a mail-order contract and disappeared 3 months later under suspicious circumstances, Owen recorded her name, the date of her arrival, and whatever details he could glean. When a minor died in what was officially termed an accident, but bore all the hallmarks of murder, Owen wrote it down. He maintained these records locked in a drawer in his cramped office above the apothecary, and he waited with the patience of a man who understands that justice, when it finally arrives, often comes late and travels slowly. Beatrice made his acquaintance when a pot of boiling water tipped from the stove and scalded her right hand severely enough to raise blisters that wept clear fluid and hurt with an intensity that made her vision swim. Lucinda dispatched her to Owen because the widow could ill afford to lose help and possessed insufficient confidence in her own medical skills. Owen cleaned the burn with water drawn from the pump so cold it felt like knives being inserted beneath her skin, and then applied a salve that smelled of chamomile and something astringent that made her eyes water. He wrapped her hand in strips of clean linen with the methodical efficiency of a man who had performed this exact operation countless times. "You're the young woman who arrived on Garrett's contract." It emerged less as question than statement of established fact. "Yes. And the sheriff has taken it upon himself to look after you." Definitely not a question this time. Beatrice hesitated, some instinct warning her to measure her words carefully. "He says he's helping." Owen secured the final knot in the bandage and raised his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were tired, weathered by years of witnessing suffering he could not prevent. But they remained clear and absolutely free of illusion. "The sheriff doesn't help Miss Harper. He invests. He extends credit. And when that investment reaches maturity, he collects what he's owed. With interest. Always with interest." He paused, seemed to weigh something internal, then continued. Jonathan Garrett discovered what Cornelius was doing with the water rights. He possessed evidence documents, forged deeds. He intended to present that evidence to the circuit judge during his next visit. So Cornelius had him murdered. And now you're here, and Cornelius owns your debt before you even understood you'd incurred one. That's how the mechanism functions. The words hung in the air between them like gun smoke after a shot, acrid and impossible to ignore. Beatrice wanted to protest, to insist that the world could not possibly be so thoroughly corrupted, that law must still mean something. But she thought of Lucinda's frightened eyes, of the whispers that died when Cornelius walked past, of the women who vanished. She remained silent. Owen turned away to wash his hands in a basin by the window. His shoulders carried tension like a yoke. "Exercise caution, Miss Harper. In Red Rock, there's only one path out, and that path runs straight through the heart of darkness. The price of passage is always paid in blood." The trap closed on a night when the cold was so savage. It turned indrawn breath to ice crystals in the lungs, when exposed skin froze in minutes, and frostbite claimed the unwary like a tax collector demanding his due. Beatrice had ventured to the river to fetch water, carrying 2 wooden buckets that banged against her shins, with every step raising bruises she would not discover until the following morning. The path descended steeply, treacherous with ice that glinted in the failing light like scales on some vast serpent. She had nearly completed her return journey when she saw them, 2 men knee-deep in the reeds at the water's edge, laboring to drag something heavy wrapped in canvas that had been sewn shut with rough stitches. The bundle was substantial enough that both men strained under its weight. It struck stones with a hollow sound that was unmistakably the sound of dead weight, specifically weight that had once been alive. Beatrice froze. The bucket slipped from her nerveless fingers. Water sloshed across her boots, soaking through to her stockings, the cold a shock that traveled up her legs like electricity. The men were deputies. She recognized them both. The first was Phineas, whom the townspeople called Tame Tom, because he possessed the perpetually startled aspect of a man who expected the sky to fall at any moment. The second was Broader Nameless to her, with the flat affect of a man who had stopped asking questions, because questions led to answers he preferred not to possess. They hauled their burden through the reeds with grunts of effort, breath steaming in the frigid air. Then Phineas turned, and the lantern light caught his face full on. What Beatrice saw there was not cruelty or malice. It was terror so profound and comprehensive, it had hollowed him out from the inside, leaving only a shell that went through the motions of living, because it did not know what else to do. His mouth opened in what might have been a shout or might have been a prayer. She could not tell which. She ran. Her boots lost purchase on ice. Branches clawed at her skirt like skeletal fingers. Behind her, shouts erupted, coarse, urgent, ugly with panic. A hand materialized from darkness and seized her sleeve fabric, tearing with a sound like canvas ripping. She wrenched herself free with strength born of pure terror. Half fell down a muddy embankment, struck the frozen ground, hard enough to drive all air from her lungs in a single explosive gasp. The cold penetrated her dress instantaneously, a shock so complete it felt less like cold than like burning. She scrambled upright, gasping like a landed fish, and ran with the single-minded desperation of prey that knows the predator is close behind. She achieved the boarding house steps more through momentum than coordination, and barely managed to climb them before her legs gave out entirely. She made it to her room, turned the key in the lock, with hands that shook so violently she nearly dropped it, then collapsed with her spine against the door. She sat there shaking with a violence that had nothing to do with cold teeth chattering so hard she feared they might shatter. She did not know precisely what she had witnessed. Some part of her did not want to know. But knowledge once glimpsed cannot be unlearned. It lodges in the mind like a splinter festering. Sheriff Cornelius materialized in her doorway before dawn. He did not knock. The door simply opened. Lucinda must have provided him a master key. He stood silhouetted against the dim light from the hallway, and when he stepped inside and closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch sounded exactly like a cell door slamming shut. "You saw something you shouldn't have?" His voice retained its characteristic gentleness. That quality made everything worse. "That complicates matters. Beatrice's mouth had gone dry as sun-bleached bone. "I don't know what you... Please don't insult my intelligence by lying." He held up one hand in a gesture that might have been paternal under different circumstances. Then he produced two documents from inside his coat. The first was her contract signed, stamped entirely legal. The second was newer, the ink still possessing that particular sharpness of recent application. It was a formal criminal complaint accusing her of fraud, theft, and traveling under false pretenses, signed by a merchant she had never encountered and witnessed by a judge she would never meet. A woman arriving in the territory under false pretenses, defrauding honest men of their hard-earned money, it's a common enough story. The territorial judge in Dagger Point would absolutely believe it. "You would spend 5 years in prison, Miss Harper. If you survived that long, which statistics suggest you would not." He paused, allowing the full weight of that future to settle over her like a shroud. "Or you could choose to do exactly what I tell you to do, and this unfortunate misunderstanding disappears entirely. You'll even receive a fresh start when our business is concluded. You have my word as an officer of the law." She wanted to spit in his face, wanted to scream accusations until her throat bled. But she was 19 years old, utterly alone, and so comprehensively outmatched that resistance seemed not merely futile, but absurd. "What do you want?" His smile was a blade wrapped in velvet. "You're going to marry the Apache." It was not mercy. It was not even cruelty in the traditional sense. It was strategy cold and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. In the territory, a white woman who married an Apache became instantly and irrevocably ruined in the eyes of polite society. Her testimony in any court would be worth precisely nothing. She could be dismissed with a sneer, her words discarded without consideration. Even if the marriage was later dissolved or annulled, the stain would remain permanent as a brand. Cornelius was not attempting to humiliate her. He was systematically erasing her as a credible witness, weaponizing the territory's casual racism with the efficiency of a general deploying artillery. The ceremony was staged in the courthouse on a morning when low clouds pressed down like a lid on a coffin, and the wind carried knives. The room was packed beyond capacity, men crowding the benches and standing 3 deep along the walls, eager for the spectacle, exchanging bets on whether the savage would attempt to bolt or whether the woman would faint dead away. It was theater entertainment, a story they would retell in saloons for months. Beatrice was the unwilling star. She wore a borrowed dress that smelled of camphor and stale grief. Her hands shook with such violence she kept them buried in the folds of her skirt, lest everyone see her terror made manifest. She had not slept. Food was impossible. She felt hollowed out, a shell so fragile that the slightest touch might cause her to shatter into fragments too small to reassemble. Pakwa was escorted in with his wrists still bound the rope, so saturated with blood it had turned stiff and dark. He wore buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt that had faded from white to gray through countless washings. His face had achieved an expression beyond blankness, a deliberate emptiness, the look of a man who refused to grant his captors the satisfaction of witnessing his suffering. When his gaze found Beatrice across the room, something flickered in those dark eyes. Not pity, recognition. He saw her for precisely what she was trapped, same as him, by a man who understood that the cruelest chains were the ones constructed from law and prejudice rather than iron. Then the clerk was a diminutive man with ink perpetually staining his fingers and a tremor in his voice that suggested he found this entire proceeding distasteful, but lacked the courage to object. He rushed through the vows as if the words themselves were contaminated, keeping his gaze fixed on the paper before him, as if reading from a script for a play he wished he could leave. When the clerk reached the portion where Beatrice was meant to give her consent, her throat sealed shut. The words would not emerge. They lodged there like stones too heavy to lift, too sharp to swallow. Sheriff Cornelius stepped forward with the easy confidence of a man who had orchestrated this exact scenario and knew precisely how it would conclude. His hand settled on her shoulder with proprietary familiarity. He smiled at the assembled crowd. She does. Laughter erupted like a flock of crows taking flight, harsh, ugly, delighted by this public degradation. Someone spat on the floor with theatrical contempt. Another man muttered something obscene that drew even more laughter. Pakwa leaned fractionally toward her, his voice pitched for her ears alone. Do not fight the rope. Save your hands. She did not comprehend his meaning, but she nodded because it was the only response remaining to her. Cornelius leaned close, his breath warm against her ear, and delivered the truth in a whisper. Now your word is worth precisely nothing. No court in the territory will hear you. No judge will grant you credence. You're married to a savage, Miss Harper. That makes you less than a woman in the eyes of the law. You witnessed something at the river. That doesn't matter anymore. You belong to me now in every way that counts. That was when understanding arrived. With the force of revelation, the cage was not constructed of iron bars or locked doors. It was built from statutes and precedents, and the willingness of ordinary people to look away from injustice when acknowledging it might prove inconvenient. And the only method of breaking such a cage was to burn it to ash and build something new from the ruins. They were released into the town's casual cruelty like animals turned loose for sport. They received a room behind the livery stable if the word room could be applied to a space barely large enough to contain a straw mattress and a single three-legged chair. The walls were constructed of planks so poorly fitted that gaps between them admitted wind and allowed anyone passing by to observe the occupants. The roof leaked when it rained and admitted snow when it did not. The omnipresent smell of horse manure saturated everything clothing hareskin. The town's hostility was immediate, comprehensive, and entirely predictable. Men shouted epithets from doorways and windows. Women turned their backs with theatrical revulsion when Beatrice walked past, physically pulling their children away, as if she carried contagion that could be transmitted through proximity. The general store refused to sell them supplies. The blacksmith refused to shoe their horse. Sheriff Cornelius issued an order that Pakwa's wrists remain bound until such time as he demonstrates he poses no flight risk. Everyone understood it was not about flight risk. It was about systematic degradation performed in public, designed to break both body and spirit. That first night alone in the dark, with wind howling through the gaps in the walls like the voices of the damned Pakwa, sat on the dirt floor and employed his teeth and a broken nail to work the knots loose. The process consumed over an hour. Beatrice watched from the mattress, uncertain whether offering assistance would help or hinder, paralyzed by her own ignorance. She could see the way his jaw muscles bunched with effort, see fresh blood welling where the rope continued its patient work of flaying him to bone. When his hands finally came free, he did not waste time rubbing his wrists or examining the damage. He simply took the rope and wrapped it around himself again, loose enough to slip free in a heartbeat, tight enough to appear convincing from any distance. We leave before dawn. His voice was steady, certain. You cannot prevail in a room he owns. The only choice is to relocate the battlefield. Beatrice pulled her knees tight against her chest, trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. He'll hunt us. Yes. He'll kill us. Perhaps. Pakwa finally looked at her directly, and in the dim light, his eyes were unreadable. Or perhaps we survive long enough to make him answer for what he's done. That's the wager we're making. She told him everything then, about the bundle in the reeds, about the existential terror in Phineas's eyes, about Cornelius's whispered threats in the darkness. The words emerged in a torrent, tripping over themselves in their eagerness to escape. And when she finally fell silent, the room felt heavier than before, as if the truth itself possessed physical weight. He's not merely burying bodies. Pakwa's voice remained flat, devoid of inflection. He's systematically acquiring water rights, ensnaring women who arrive alone, employing law itself as a weapon. I've witnessed this pattern before in other territories. The specific mechanisms vary. The underlying cruelty does not. How do you know all this? Because I came to Red Rock searching for someone. For the first time, emotion crept into his voice, a hairline fracture in his composure. A girl, Apache like me. Her name is Enola. She's 15 years old. She came to trade baskets 3 weeks ago and never returned. I believe Cornelius has her. I believe he keeps whatever he wishes to hide in the mine. Beatrice felt something cold and immovable settle in her chest, heavy as a gravestone. Then what do? We run. We find evidence that cannot be dismissed or destroyed. We deliver it to someone who possesses both the authority and the integrity to act upon it. They fled in that liminal hour before dawn, when the world exists in grayscale, and the boundary between night and day has not yet been negotiated. Pakwa moved like smoke, given form low and fast and utterly silent. Beatrice stumbled after him, her skirts tangling around her legs, her breath sawing at her lungs like rusty blades. Behind them, shouts erupted, followed quickly by gunfire, sharp reports that split the darkness and sent bullets hissing past like angry wasps. Pakwa taught her to run in bursts, to exploit every subtle fold in the terrain, for cover to time her movements, in the intervals between shots when the shooters would be reloading. When she fell, which she did repeatedly, scraping her palms bloody on ice and stones, he did not waste time pulling her upright or offering sympathy. He barked commands that kept her alive. Breathe. Count to 3. Move when I move. Now. In a shallow gully where wind had carved the snow into drifts, Pakwa pressed a revolver into her hands. The weapon was impossibly heavy, utterly foreign, terrifying in its potential for violence. Her fingers had gone numb, clumsy as wooden blocks. She fumbled with the loading gate, trying to check the cartridges, the way she had observed men doing in saloons, and one slipped free, disappearing into snow as if it had never existed. "Blast it!" she whispered, her voice fracturing on the words. Pakwa did the only thing that made sense. In that moment, he took her hands between his, not gently, but with purpose. He pressed warmth into frozen flesh until sensation began to return in needle-prick increments. Not comfort, function. You require these hands. Keep them warm. Keep them capable. She swallowed a sob that wanted desperately to escape and nodded. She tried again, and this time the cylinder clicked into place, with a sound that felt like victory, however small and provisional. They found dubious shelter with Emmett, a dirt-poor farmer near Willow Gap, who hated Sheriff Cornelius with the intensity of a man who has been systematically robbed, but feared him even more. Emmett's cabin was scarcely larger than the room they had abandoned, its walls chinked with mud and straw that had cracked with age and weather. He provided bread so stale it required soaking in water before it could be chewed. And he offered information delivered in a terrified whisper, as if the very walls possessed ears, and reported to Cornelius. Sheriff's running for county office come spring. He's got men in every town between here and Dagger Point, deputies, clerks, judges who owe him favors or fear his retribution. If you intend to break him, you need evidence on paper properly signed and witnessed. Something that can't be conveniently burned or buried when it becomes inconvenient. Words alone won't suffice. He paused, weighing something internal. There's a school teacher in Red Rock, Maud Garrett. She's been maintaining records, women who arrived on contracts and disappeared, women who ended up dead or worse. She's frightened, but she possesses backbone. Perhaps she'll cooperate if she believes someone is finally listening. Maud Garrett inhabited a house behind the schoolhouse, a structure so modest it appeared ready to surrender to the next strong wind. When Beatrice and Pakwa knocked after darkness had fallen completely, Maud opened the door barely wide enough to identify her visitors, then seized them by their sleeves and physically hauled them inside her hands, shaking with such violence Beatrice could feel it through the fabric. She secured the bolt with a metallic snap that sounded like a rifle being cocked. "Have you lost your minds?" The words emerged as a hiss sharp with terror. "If anyone observes you here, if anyone even suspects I'm providing assistance, they already know everything that matters." Beatrice interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. Maud stared at her, and then at Pakwa, and something in her face underwent a transformation, an anger transmuting into resignation, and the expression of a woman who has carried a burden in solitude for far too long, and has finally encountered someone willing to help shoulder the weight, even if that help arrives too late. "You're the one who married him." It was not accusation. It was simply acknowledgement of fact. "I didn't have a choice in the matter." "None of us do." Maud's hands twisted her apron into tortured knots, wringing invisible water from the fabric. "Not in this town. Not under Cornelius. What do you want from me?" Beatrice glanced at Pakwa, who indicated his consent with a fractional nod. "We need to know who else the sheriff has trapped in his web. We need names, dates, any evidence that demonstrates a pattern rather than isolated incidents." Maud remained silent for what felt like an eternity, her gaze distant and calculating, weighing risks against potential outcomes. Finally, she crossed to a cabinet in the corner, unlocked it with a key she wore on a chain around her neck, and extracted a ledger bound in worn leather. She handed it to Beatrice with trembling hands, as if the weight of it might literally drag her under if she held it too long. "I've been keeping records." Her voice emerged barely above a whisper. "Every woman who arrived on a mail-order contract and subsequently disappeared. Every woman who ended up in the brothel or the mining camps or married to one of Cornelius's associates under circumstances no reasonable person would describe as consensual. 12 names. 12 that I know of with certainty. There are probably more I haven't discovered." Beatrice opened the ledger with hands that felt disconnected from her body, as if they belonged to someone else. The names were recorded in meticulous script: first names, surnames, towns of origin, dates of arrival. Beside each name appeared a brief notation describing what happened next. Some entries concluded with "married, no further word." Others simply stated "vanished." One read only "buried, no marker, cause undetermined." Then one name seized her attention with the force of a blow: Jonathan Garrett. Missing September 1876. Presumed dead. She raised her gaze to meet Maud's. Realization arrived cold and terrible. "Garrett, he was my brother." Maud's voice fractured on the word. "Your intended husband, the man Cornelius claimed went missing in the hills." She produced a sound that might have been laughter in another context, but emerged as something broken. "He didn't go missing. He was murdered. Because he discovered what Cornelius was doing, the water rights fraud, the trafficking, all of it. He intended to present evidence to the circuit judge during his next visit. So Cornelius had him killed and buried somewhere no one will ever find him." Beatrice felt the room tilt vertiginously. The ledger slipped from her nerveless fingers and struck the table with a sound like a coffin lid closing. "How can you be certain?" "Because Phineas told me." Maud's hands clenched into fists. "He arrived here 2 weeks ago, drunk enough to cry but not drunk enough to forget. He said Cornelius ordered him and another deputy to take Jonathan into the hills, put a bullet in his head, and bury him where scavengers would disperse the remains. Phineas complied because he was terrified. He's still terrified. But now he's also terrified that Cornelius will eliminate him because men who know too much don't survive long in Red Rock. Beatrice's throat constricted. She thought of the man she had never encountered, the man whose name appeared on a contract that had lured her west into a trap she could not possibly have anticipated. She thought of the canvas-wrapped bundle in the reeds, of the existential fear in Phineas's eyes, of the way Cornelius smiled as if the world were a stage, and he alone possessed knowledge of how the play would end. This should be sufficient, she whispered, though even as she spoke she understood it was not true. No. Pakwa's voice cut through her nascent hope like a blade through fabric. This provides context. But Cornelius will claim she's lying. He'll claim you're lying. He'll claim I'm a savage whose word carries no weight. We require something bearing his name, his signature, his hand. The ledger he maintains in the mine office, the one documenting water rights, bribes, payoffs. That's evidence that cannot be dismissed or explained away. Maud regarded him with an expression combining fear and respect in equal measure. Obtaining that ledger is tantamount to suicide. Pakwa's expression did not alter. Then we ensure it counts for something. The plan possessed the brutal simplicity characteristic of desperate strategies: infiltrate the mine locate. Enola, secure the ledger, then ride with utmost speed toward Pine Ridge Station, a stagecoach relay station 40 miles distant, where mail riders changed horses and travelers could dispatch letters eastward via the overland route. Dr. Owen maintained a contact there, a station master named Horace, who owed Owen a significant debt and who could ensure the ledger reached Fort Laramie and the territorial marshal station there. There were no telegraph lines extending this far west. Such technology remained concentrated in more established territories. The only method of transmitting evidence was to physically transport it mile by brutal mile until it reached someone possessing both authority and integrity sufficient to act. But first, they needed to survive long enough to obtain that ledger. They reached the Black Hills mine as dusk surrendered to full darkness. The valley was a wound, gouged into the earth, raw, ugly, disfigured by years of extractive violence. Timber braces groaned under the weight of countless tons of stone, pressing downward with patient malice. Lanterns hung in iron cages, their flames casting shadows that moved with disturbing autonomy, as if the darkness itself possessed will and intention. The air carried the acrid reek of blasting powder, damp stone, and something older, the smell of secrets buried so deep they had begun to fossilize. Guards patrolled the yard and the elevated walkways with rifles cradled casually but ready. Pakwa and Beatrice observed from the tree line, counting men noting patterns and gaps in coverage, calculating odds that were unfavorable but not quite impossible. Pakwa indicated a narrow coal chute on the structure's north face with a minimal gesture. Too constricted for me, not for you. Beatrice's stomach clenched as if someone had driven a fist into her solar plexus. You want me to crawl through that? I want you to survive. The question is whether you want that sufficiently to do what's necessary. She thought of Maud's ledger, of the 12 names recorded there, of Jonathan Garrett murdered for attempting to do the right thing. She thought of the roses she had clutched on the porch and how they had tumbled into snow like drops of blood against a shroud, a promise written in red and white. Yes, she said, and meant it absolutely. She crawled through the chute on her belly elbows, scraping raw against stone breath, coming in ragged gasps that she struggled to suppress lest someone hear. Dust filled her mouth and nose, choking her triggering panic that clawed at her throat with frantic fingers. But she continued moving because halting meant certain death, and death meant Enola would remain lost, and Cornelius would continue his predations unimpeded. She emerged in a storage chamber filled with wooden crates stenciled with warnings about their contents, blasting powder carefully stored but inherently dangerous. She located the door, unlatched it with hands that shook violently, and admitted Pakwa. Together, they moved through the mine with the deliberate silence of individuals who understood that a single careless sound would mean their deaths. They found Enola confined in a tool shed, bound and gagged her wrists, abraded to raw meat. She was young, painfully young, with terror and fury burning in her dark eyes with equal intensity. When she saw Pakwa, something fierce and unbroken blazed across her face. Beatrice severed her bonds with a knife appropriated from the storage room, the blade sawing through rope that smelled of mildew and confinement and cruelty. He said no one would come for me. Enola whispered in halting English, her voice hoarse from disuse. We came, Pakwa said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Then they proceeded toward the ledger. The mine office was a squat structure of raw timber at the yard's perimeter. The door was secured with a substantial lock. Pakwa forced it with a crowbar taken from the storage room, and the wood splintered with a report that sounded catastrophically loud in the darkness. Inside the office was cramped and cluttered every surface, buried under papers and maps, and the accumulated detritus of Cornelius's operations. On the desk sat a strong box locked and conspicuously heavy. Beatrice seized it without hesitation. There was no time to attempt opening it. They needed only to extract it. Then a shout erupted from the yard, sharp, urgent, unmistakable. They had been discovered. Sheriff Cornelius materialized in the doorway, like a figure from Nightmare flanked by Dirty Dan and 3 additional deputies. Dan cradled a rifle with the easy familiarity of a man intimately acquainted with violence. Behind them, blocking the only exit, stood the remainder of Cornelius's men, perhaps 6 in total, all armed, all loyal, through either genuine allegiance or simple fear. You've brought yourselves directly to my graveyard, Cornelius observed, and his voice retained its characteristic gentleness, which somehow made everything immeasurably worse. You've saved me considerable effort. Pakwa maintained his rifle trained on Cornelius with rock-steady hands. You constructed your kingdom on corpses. Now it collapses. Cornelius smiled with genuine amusement. The law is whatever I declare it to be, boy. You'll hang at dawn if you're fortunate. If you're not fortunate. He allowed the threat to dangle unfinished and therefore more terrible. Then from the shadows behind Cornelius, a figure emerged that Beatrice had not expected to see Phineas. His face had achieved the color of old paper, bloodless and fragile. His hands shook with such violence that the revolver he held wavered like a compass needle seeking north. But the barrel remained pointed at the base of Cornelius's skull with desperate determination. Drop the rifle, Dan. Phineas's voice emerged as a broken thing held together by sheer desperation and the knowledge that he had already passed the point of possible retreat. Drop it, or I decorate these walls with his brains. Cornelius pivoted slowly, his expression transmuting from confidence to cold fury in the space of a heartbeat. What exactly do you think you're doing, Phineas? What I should have done when you made me murder Jonathan Garrett. Tears cut channels through the grime on Phineas's face, catching the lantern light. His voice fractured on every other word. I heard you last night. You told Dan to kill me once this business concluded. You said I was a liability that needed eliminating. You were planning to bury me in the same unmarked hole you buried Garrett in. His voice splintered completely. I'm not going in that hole. I'm not dying for you. Not anymore. You're a coward, Cornelius hissed with venom. You lack the courage to pull that trigger. Maybe. Phineas's finger tightened fractionally on the trigger, taking up slack. But I'm finished being afraid. That counts for something. The moment stretched elastic and terrible. Then Dirty Dan made his calculation and moved swinging the rifle toward Phineas. Pakwa fired instantaneously. The report was deafening in the confined space, a physical assault on the eardrums. Dan went down with a scream, clutching his shoulder, where the bullet had torn through muscle and bone. Cornelius lunged for Beatrice with startling speed, his hand closing around her throat with crushing force. Pakwa could not fire. Beatrice was too close, the angle impossible, the risk of hitting her too high. But Beatrice did not freeze. Some part of her that had been forged in the crucible of the past weeks responded without conscious thought. She drove the mining knife upward with desperate strength, felt the blade bite deep into Cornelius's forearm. He bellowed, jerking backward, and Pakwa used that instant to drive the rifle butt into his chest with calculated force, sending him sprawling. "The powder!" Pakwa shouted. "Now!" They ran back to the storage room, seizing crates of blasting powder. Pakwa kicked over a lantern with deliberate violence. Kerosene spilled across the wooden floor in an expanding pool, flames blooming with hungry enthusiasm. "Run now!" They bolted through the back exit, as bullets chewed splinters from the doorframe, as shouts filled the air, as chaos erupted like a fever breaking. Behind them, fire found the powder. The explosion did not merely sound loud, it redefined the concept. It was the voice of God rendered as pure wrath, a pressure wave that propagated through earth and air and bone with equal enthusiasm. The concussion was a physical blow that lifted them from their feet and hurled them forward like leaves before a gale. The mine office simply ceased to exist, transmuted into splinters and fire and smoke. The shock wave struck the tunnel supports with devastating force, and the mine began its final collapse in a cascading failure that sounded like the world ending. Sheriff Cornelius was caught in the open yard when the mountain decided to reclaim what had been stolen from it. A massive timber beam torn free by the explosion descended across his legs like judgment rendered visible. His scream was swallowed by the thunder of collapsing stone. He clawed at the frozen ground with his fingers mouth open in a soundless howl of animal terror as tons of rock and earth buried him alive, erasing him as thoroughly as he had erased so many others. Pakwa hauled Beatrice to her feet with bruising urgency. They ran through smoke and chaos, half-blind lungs burning, as the valley filled with destruction's soundtrack. Phineas staggered after them, blood soaking through his shirt from wounds Beatrice could not clearly see in the darkness and confusion. He thrust a packet of papers into her hands. With desperate force, the ledger copy he had laboriously created weeks prior insurance against a future he had known was inevitable. "Tell them," he gasped, blood bubbling at the corners of his mouth. "Tell them everything. Make it count." Then he collapsed. Dr. Owen, who had arrived with Emmett and a handful of townsmen drawn by the explosion, dropped to his knees beside the fallen deputy. But there was too much blood, too much damage, too much that could not be repaired with the limited tools at Owen's disposal. Phineas died with his eyes open, staring at stars finally visible through the smoke, his face achieving an expression that might have been peace, or might simply have been the absence of fear. They rode through that night and into the next day, and the day after that 4 riders on horses pushed to the absolute limits of equine endurance, racing across a landscape that seemed designed specifically to kill them. The cold was a living enemy, gnawing at exposed flesh, seeking entry through every gap in their inadequate clothing. The wind carried ice crystals that struck like thrown sand, abrading skin until it bled. They slept in the saddle when sleep became unavoidable, taking turns maintaining watch while the others slumped forward with their fingers tangled in manes to prevent them from falling. They consumed jerky so desiccated it had to be held in the mouth until saliva softened it sufficiently to chew. And they drank from half-frozen streams where the water was so cold it made their teeth ache. The hunger was a constant gnawing presence, never satisfied, only temporarily muted. But worse than hunger was the exhaustion, the kind of profound weariness that seeped into bone and made simple tasks like mounting a horse feel like climbing a mountain. Beatrice discovered muscles she had not known existed through the medium of pain. Her thighs were rubbed raw from the saddle despite the layers of skirt. Her hands developed blisters that burst and wept and reformed. Her lips cracked and bled. She learned that the human body could continue functioning long after the mind had concluded that continuation was impossible. Twice they spotted riders on the horizon, distant figures that might have been Cornelius's remaining men or might have been innocent travelers. They took no chances detouring into broken country where pursuit would be difficult, losing precious hours but remaining alive to lose them. On the second night, sheltering in a narrow canyon where wind could not quite reach them, Beatrice sat with her spine pressed against stone that felt colder than the air, and watched Pakwa tend to Enola's injuries with infinite patience and gentleness. He cleaned the abraded flesh with water heated over their meager fire, applied a salve Owen had provided, wrapped the wounds in strips torn from his own shirt. The girl watched him with an expression combining profound trust and equally profound exhaustion. "When this concludes," Beatrice said quietly, her voice rough from disuse and cold, "what will you do?" Pakwa did not immediately respond, concentrating on securing the bandage. Finally, he said, "I will take Enola home, back to her people, where she belongs." And after that, he was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. Then, "I do not know. I have spent so long searching, running, surviving, moment to moment, that I've forgotten what it means to plan for a future beyond the next dawn." Beatrice pulled her coat tighter against the cold that was both external and internal. "I have nowhere to return to. No family waiting. Nothing." Pakwa raised his gaze to meet hers across the small fire. In the flickering light, his eyes were dark as wells deep enough to drown in. "You possess hands that did not break. That is not nothing. It may in fact be everything." She did not know if it was sufficient, but perhaps sufficient was too much to hope for. Perhaps barely enough would have to serve. They achieved Pine Ridge Station on the dawn of the third day, arriving more dead than alive. Horace, the station master, was a man in his 60s with a pronounced limp from an old injury and eyes that had witnessed sufficient human misery to no longer be easily shocked. He listened to Dr. Owen's terse explanation, examined the papers with methodical care, and nodded with the decisiveness of a man accustomed to making judgments quickly. "I can place this on the next eastbound stage. It will reach Fort Laramie in 4 days, perhaps 5 if weather intervenes." But Beatrice shook her head with surprising vehemence. "That's insufficient. We require someone who can act immediately." Horace studied her with an appraising gaze, then retrieved a ledger of his own, and this one containing schedules and routes. "The circuit judge is due in Dagger Point in 3 days' time. Samuel Fenton. He possesses a reputation for honesty, which makes him rare as diamonds in this territory. If you can deliver this evidence to him, he possesses the authority to convene an immediate hearing. But Dagger Point is 50 miles northeast, and the route crosses open country where you'll be exposed and vulnerable." Pakwa met Beatrice's gaze across the station's dim interior. "We go." Horace nodded slowly. "Then you'd best leave immediately, and ride as if the devil himself were giving chase, because in a very real sense, he is." The ride to Dagger Point was not merely difficult. It was an extended exercise in discovering exactly how much suffering the human body and spirit could endure before simply surrendering. They continued sleeping in the saddle, jerking awake when they began to slip sideways, their bodies operating on instinct, while their minds retreated to someplace safe and far away. They consumed the last of their provisions and then continued riding with empty bellies that cramped and twisted. The horses were in scarcely better condition, ribs beginning to show through their coats, eyes dull with exhaustion. But the animals understood, in whatever manner horses understand such things, that this journey mattered, and they continued placing one hoof in front of another with the stolid determination characteristic of their kind. On the third morning, with Dagger Point finally visible on the horizon, they encountered riders, 3 men on fresh horses, moving with purpose. For a terrible moment, Beatrice thought they were Cornelius's men, impossibly persistent. Then she recognized one of them, a deputy from a neighboring town, who had testified against Cornelius's water rights scheme years prior and been ignored. "We heard about the mine," the deputy called out as he drew near. "Heard Cornelius is dead and you're carrying evidence. Judge Fenton's in town. He's waiting for you." Dagger Point was substantially larger than Red Rock, a town positioned at a crucial crossroads, and therefore thriving through commerce rather than extraction. The courthouse was an impressive 2-story structure with genuine glass windows and a roof constructed of slate rather than wood shingles. Judge Samuel Fenton presided from behind a massive oak desk, a man in his late 60s with white hair, a stern countenance, and a reputation for incorruptibility that had made him numerous enemies and very few friends. The courtroom was packed beyond its designed capacity, townspeople crowding every available space, standing 3 deep along the walls, their faces reflecting curiosity, skepticism, hope, and in some cases, naked hostility. Beatrice stood before Judge Fenton with a strongbox on the table before her, flanked by Pakwa and Dr. Owen, and laid out the evidence with methodical precision, Maud's ledger documenting 12 disappeared women and the strongbox contents, revealing bribes, and forged water rights transfers the ledger copy bearing Cornelius's own signature, the sworn testimony of Dr. Owen, regarding suspicious deaths and disappearances spanning 2 years. Judge Fenton examined every page with excruciating care, his reading spectacles reflecting lantern light as his eyes tracked across the text. He asked questions, hard-pointed questions, designed to probe for inconsistencies or fabrications that made Beatrice's voice falter and her hands tremble. But she answered each one as completely as she could, drawing on reserves of strength she had not known she possessed. When she finished, the courtroom had achieved a silence so complete that Beatrice could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Fenton removed his spectacles and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, a gesture that seemed calculated to extend the tension to its breaking point. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of law wielded with genuine purpose, rather than as a weapon of oppression. "This is the most comprehensive documentation of systematic corruption I have encountered in 23 years on the bench." He set down the final page with care. If even half of these allegations prove accurate, and I believe substantially more than half will, then Sheriff Mortimer Cornelius was operating a criminal enterprise under color of law, subverting the very institutions meant to protect citizens from predation. His gaze swept the packed courtroom. The primary offender is deceased, killed by his own machinations, which represents a certain poetic justice, but complicates prosecution. However, his accomplices are named here. He lifted the ledger slightly. Deputies who assisted in murders, clerks who forged documents, a judge. He paused, his expression hardening. In this very town, who accepted bribes to overlook irregularities. A murmur rippled through the crowd, part anger and part vindication. Fenton raised one hand, and silence returned instantly. "I am hereby convening an official territorial hearing. Warrants will be issued for all individuals named in this evidence. Arrests will be made. Trials will be conducted according to law, actual law, not the perverted mockery Cornelius practiced. The water rights will be returned to public trust. And Miss Harper's marriage," he looked directly at Beatrice, "contracted under duress, signed under false pretenses, and performed without genuine consent, is hereby declared null and void." You are a free woman under law. The courtroom erupted into chaos, some voices raised in approval, others in outrage, still others in disbelief. But Beatrice heard none of it. She felt something inside her that had been clenched tight as a fist for weeks finally begin to relax, felt the weight of fear and shame begin to lift, like fog burning off under morning sun. It was not joy, not quite. But it was the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. The territorial hearing consumed 3 weeks, and those weeks felt longer than all the time that had preceded them. Witnesses were summoned and examined. Evidence was scrutinized with forensic precision. Men were arrested, some attempting to flee and being apprehended at territorial borders, others surrendering with the defeated air of individuals who had always known this reckoning would eventually arrive. Trials proceeded with the measured deliberation of genuine justice, rather than the hurried mockery that had characterized Cornelius's regime. Some men were convicted and hanged, their executions witnessed by crowds that gathered in grim silence. Others received prison sentences that would consume the remainder of their productive years. A few, those who could demonstrate minimal involvement or who turned evidence against their co-conspirators, received lighter sentences or even clemency in exchange for their cooperation. The water rights were formally transferred to a public trust administered by representatives from multiple towns, ensuring that no single individual could again monopolize such a vital resource. Widow's Well was rebuilt and expanded, its water declared available to all at fair rates. Maud testified on the hearing's second day, her voice growing steadier with each word, as she recounted what she had witnessed and recorded. Dr. Owen provided corroborating medical evidence, injuries inconsistent with official explanations, deaths attributed to accidents that bore clear signs of violence. And Beatrice stood before a courtroom full of men, many of whom had dismissed her, ignored her, or actively contributed to the machinery of her oppression, and told them in excruciating detail exactly how that machinery functioned and who had constructed it. When Judge Fenton delivered his final ruling from the bench, his voice carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. Justice in this territory has been purchased with too much blood and far too much suffering. Today that changes. These convictions stand. The corruption that infected Red Rock like a cancer has been excised. And let it be known to anyone contemplating similar schemes, this court will be waiting. And this court's memory is long. The gavel fell with a sound like a rifle shot, final and irrevocable. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as if uncertain it would be welcome. The snow melted in muddy rivulets that carved temporary rivers through the streets. Green shoots emerged from frozen earth, tentative but determined. Birds returned, filling the air with song that sounded almost defiant after the winter's silence. On the porch of Maud's modest house, a structure that had been repaired and expanded through community effort, Beatrice stood with the morning sun warm on her face, holding a bouquet of red roses. These were not the pathetic wilted things she had clutched months earlier. These had been grown in Maud's garden with patient care, tended through the winter by protecting them with burlap and prayer. They were fresh, vibrant, alive proof incarnate that living things could survive winter if given protection and care. And the stubborn refusal to surrender. Pakwa stood beside her Enola at his other side. They were preparing to leave, heading west toward the girl's people, toward territory where they might live without constant vigilance, without the weight of others' prejudices pressing down like a physical burden. "You could accompany us," Pakwa said. It was phrased as statement rather than question, but the invitation was unmistakable. Beatrice shook her head gently, though the gesture cost her more than she wished to acknowledge. "I have work remaining here. Maud requires assistance with the school, or there are more children now as families feel safe enough to settle. Dr. Owen needs someone to maintain his records and help with patients. And there will be more women arriving on contracts, women who require someone to watch for the traps Cornelia set. She paused, then added softly, "Besides, I'm not finished fighting yet." Pakwa nodded slowly, as if he had anticipated precisely that response. Then he extended his hand, and Beatrice took it. His grip was warm, calloused, solid, real in a way that so much of the past months had felt like nightmare. They stood like that for a long moment, two people who had walked through hell together and emerged scarred but unbroken. "You kept your hands," he said quietly, and she understood he meant far more than the literal interpretation. He meant she had not allowed them to break her, had not surrendered her essential self, despite every attempt to strip it away. "So, did you?" she replied, and the words felt like a benediction, a recognition of shared survival. He released her hand, swung into the saddle with the fluid grace of someone born to riding, and Enola followed suit. They rode away from Red Rock as the sun climbed higher, two figures growing smaller against the vast canvas of prairie and sky, until distance swallowed them completely, and they existed only in memory. Beatrice watched until they disappeared entirely, then turned back toward the house where Maud stood in the doorway, with a tentative smile where Dr. Owen walked up the road, carrying his ever-present medical bag, where a town was learning slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely, what it meant to live without the constant weight of fear. She carried the roses inside and placed them in a glass jar on the kitchen table, where sunlight streaming through the window made them glow as if lit from within. They sat there whole and vital and real proof that winter could be survived, that spring inevitably arrived, no matter how long and brutal the cold, that beauty could grow even in soil that had been saturated with blood and tears and all the accumulated suffering of people who had been told their suffering did not matter. And in that small, hard-won victory in the roses that lived where roses had died, in the voice that spoke, where silence had been demanded, in the woman who stood free where a cage had been constructed, Beatrice Harper found something she had believed lost forever, and the beginning of a life that belonged to her, alone, earned not through contracts or submission or the approval of men who viewed her as property, but through blood and courage and the simple, stubborn refusal to be erased.